Welcome, everybody, to Do More Better. This is the 4th episode of an installment about ADHD. So, seriously,
long haul.
It was, ADHD. I hope to, as we've been looking back and editing these and putting them up for people to witness, that by no means do we ever expect that a single episode is going to encapsulate an idea we're talking about. There's no way a 30-minute conversation on depression gets every idea about depression. But we did break down this ADHD one because we knew that, there's a lot of components, and if you are a family that has a child with ADHD, that there's a lot of ins and outs to discuss about it. This episode, the 4th of the series, is about what you can expect when you come and see somebody that does what we do. So we've been talking about the diagnostic process. We talked about medication. We talked about non-medication and non-behavioral interventions. And then this episode is supposed to be a little bit about what you could take away from somebody that does what we do.
Yeah, kind of what would we do?
Yeah.
I wonder, I think this one took more time because it is so combination of medical and behavioral. I don't know. It felt like when we started talking about this one that an episode wouldn't do it.
Right.
2 episodes wouldn't do it. And 3, so 4, kind of what we stumbled on.
I mean, we're going to eventually, we're going to have 6. We're going to revisit everything.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
but I hope everybody knows before we ever get going on anything that there's a lot that goes into deciding when a family is ready for a behavioral intervention or a change to what they do behaviorally, or what child readiness or family readiness looks like. That even the things we talk about, it really is good to link up with somebody that does work with you for their therapeutic purposes or with a psychologist, because it's the things we're talking about are not just like hit the ground running and like, okay, good, go do that.
Right. I think when we started talking about this one, there's any family we work with, any individuals we work with who have ADHD, the treatment plan is fairly individualized. Although we have some principles that we're going to work from, and those principles might stay the same from family to family or from individual to individual. It might look totally different from one person to the next. So I think when you watch this episode, we're not going to say, here is exactly what you would do with yourself or with your child. But these are probably some general ideas that we work from and we'll think they'd be helpful.
Yeah. I think about it like the bottom level of the pyramid. Like your intervention should have these things we're talking about. It may not be a specific intervention that you would take away from the episode and go do with a child, but it's kind of the idea that like the intervention that you're doing for a kid with ADHD should probably have this as like a foundational part of the process.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. It's funny now you say that. It's like I think when we first become psychologists, we get PhDs and we finish school, we learn all these manualized treatments, these really specific treatment approaches that are supposed to work for this or that or whatever. And then as we got doing it longer and longer, we start finding
it's very programmatic. It's like, your kid is wetting the bed, do this intervention.
Session 1, you do this. Session 2, you do this. Session 3, you do this. And then we found more and more that really doesn't work very well. I mean, it works for those randomized controlled trials to see if it's actually working. But when you come to an actual clinical sample, of a kid with ADHD who also has a little anxiety, who has, 115 IQ, who has, this parent doing this parent doing that, it just changes things so much. And so I think that's where we both have kind of come back to, like we have these ideas, we have these principles, and we use those, and those tend to work.
I hope people know, maybe as a small plug for what we do, that we mentioned it earlier, but the research indicates that medication works, that behavioral intervention works. The combination of the two is the best outcome. But even beyond that, the best possible outcome is the introduction of behavioral interventions first, and then medication as an intervention second. And those two together is the best possible outcome for trying to help these children that have ADHD.
Right. Yep. I got nothing else to say to that. All right. That was good. Hit the nail on the head there.
Okay. So you have a family come in. You've done some sort of assessment process. Now you say, okay, I think this is a kid with ADHD. What are some ideas behind the interventions that we do? And we've got a list in front of us here, but what are some of the things that you would say, I think this needs to be a part of the intervention?
I don't think this is what we were thinking about initially.
Okay, we'll scrap that.
No, and I think it is. I think repetition, lots and lots and lots of repetition. This is a marathon, not a sprint. There's no one intervention that's going to quickly fix things. There's no one lecture you can give your kid that's going to change them. What it's going to be is lots of repetition. And so, which I think gets to our first point, is that this is not something you're going to remove right away.
Yeah.
And so if you come to somebody like us, or you're listening to us right now, there's not one thing that's going to work and then we stop it. Which I think was kind of your first point too.
Yeah, I thought about it. I didn't think we were going to go here either, but I thought about it like I see it in schools all the time, that they put an intervention in place for a kid and then they get pretty decent results and then they take the intervention away. And I feel like that's like telling somebody, hey, you should probably change the oil in your car. And then once you've done that, good. Okay, you can stop changing the oil. And that's not the way it's going to go. But I do think, I would tell anybody, for any type of behavioral intervention, the internal change comes so much later than the behavior change. And so whenever you get to a point where you feel like you see behavior change in somebody, just know the internal change is coming much longer after that. It's going to be a long time. So, if I were to run every day right now, I would just think of myself as like, okay, I got to go run today. 2 years from now, I would think, oh, I'm a runner. I run every day.
Right. I'm glad you explained, because I think that idea of the internal for the listener might not be so obvious. And so I think the deodorant example for that. So I remember this we're stealing from one of our supervisors some years ago, is that, when you very first start putting on deodorant, you put it on because you realize you kind of stunk and like the people around you didn't really want to talk to you. There's somebody you found attractive that was not hanging out with you. Like, I think for me, it smelled like some version of Fritos. That's not really weird.
Your armpits or the
I remember like around puberty that time, I was like, oh God, that's really, why do I stink so bad?
Okay.
And so you start wearing deodorant and you do it and you do it and you do it over and over again. And one day you wake up and you're on vacation and you did it. There's nobody around.
Right.
Like, you're not going to see anybody that day. And then you did it. And why? Because you think you're supposed to. And so what Wes is talking about is that internal change of like, I'm supposed to do this because it's the right thing to do, took years.
Yeah.
But it was also, initially, it was based on some idea of external reinforcement, is that like, oh, the people I find attractive are not talking to me, so I better put this on.
Yeah. I remember, I think it was Friman. Friman always said, first you put on deodorant because your mom told you to. Then you put on deodorant because you're worried you're going to stink and you don't want to get made fun of. And then you start putting on deodorant because that's just
what you do.
What you did. Spend 3,000 days of putting on deodorant, so that's what you do.
Yeah, and you do. And now people do it just because they think it's the right thing to do. And so kids are the same, or they work that way. And there's going to be lots and lots of repetition. And so repetition, like, just to get the external reward of like, oh, people don't walk away from me when I don't stink, eventually turns into the internal change of I do it because it's the right thing to do. That's, I think, what you were getting at there.
I think that's probably the hardest part of everything that we put up in front of people that are working with us is, I didn't think we were going to talk about this, but I mean, telling someone, yeah, about 1,000 repetitions from now, you're going to start seeing some progress, different. I mean, every person ever wanting to lose weight, the solution is simple. It's calories in versus calorie out. It's exercise and diet. That's what it is. But there's 1 million books written on losing weight because nobody really likes that answer. Hey, that thing you did, just go do it for 6 months. That's the intervention. Oh, that's really difficult for people.
And there are tons of people making money on the other idea, which is it's not true.
Right.
That quick intervention, the one thing you can tell your kid, the one lecture that you'll have, or the like one pill that you'll take will fix everything. It's just, it doesn't work that way. It's repetition and repetition and repetition and repetition. And over time, repetition alters your personality construct, who you are as a person and what you believe.
And when we say repetition, I mean, we mean repetition. We mean thousands upon thousands.
And like, we should probably add the second part to that. It's repetition with contrast too.
Right.
And so the second part of that is, the repetition of the behavior we want to see results in something that you like, and the behavior we don't want to see results in something you don't like.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of I generally, I think the first thing that you brought up of the idea is that we removed the intervention too quickly.
Yeah. If you have a child with ADHD and you want them to learn and understand a difference in behavior and expectation, it's going to look like putting an intervention in place and then keeping it there for quite a long time. It's not reaching a result and then and then taking it away.
Mm-hmm.
That's just, again, I just see it happen in the schools all the time. Oh, well, we got him paying attention, so let's take away the intervention.
Mm-hmm.
That's working. The intervention is working. Keep it there.
And what we're shooting for is the behavior that they're doing is becoming a habit that's got like an internal motivation, and sometimes external motivation over a long enough period of time turns into internal motivation, but it doesn't happen that quickly.
Right. It takes a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess foundational principle number one would just be don't pull the intervention away. Once you start getting good results, just keep doing it. Keep your foot on the gas pedal. Keep doing the intervention.
Right. If anything, you could fade the intervention a little bit.
Yeah.
And so if you've got an intervention in place where, you're earning, I don't know, kids are, I'm trying to think of something without like being too prescriptive here too. Kids earning, 15 minutes of like free time at school for, 2 hours of good behavior. You could increase that amount of time frame and still have the same amount of free time. So you could fade the intervention, but fade it slowly. It's not hurting anything.
Maybe point systems is a good analogy here, just because I think most people are pretty familiar with some idea of like a sticker chart or a point system within the schools. But the idea would be you really have to kind of live and die with a point system, and you kind of have to live and die with a behavioral intervention a lot of the time. And so the moment you get to where things are going well, it's not an indicator to pull things away. It's an indicator to keep pressing on and keep doing it.
Right. I would think that if that's the I don't want to say too prescriptively, because when you come see a psychologist, like I said, it will be very individualized, but point systems, token systems, point cards, things like that are the stuff that works really well for kids with ADHD. But they're going to take a while. Mm-hmm. And they're not going to just stop because we see progress. We're going to fade it a little bit back. So increase the amount of effort required to get the reward. And then over time, over a year or two, then maybe we can start to pull it away.
I think the issue I see with families most often is just that there's a little bit of novelty that comes with any new behavioral intervention. And the kid's just kind of interested because it's like, oh, I'm earning points and that's interesting. And then the kid stops being interested in the points or the rock in the jar or the pebble, whatever you're doing. And the idea would be, don't stop doing it. You have to kind of get through that lull where the child stops being just enamored with the fact that they're earning points from you, that you have to actually kind of live and die with it. It's a real change in the way you're going to start operating with their behavior.
Right. You always get that honeymoon period where it's new and fun and different. And then, it loses its funness. It loses, but if you stick with it, and this is the only way that you can earn that thing we're talking about, it makes it become a habit.
It'll circle back around and they're going to care about it again if you just hold out long enough.
Right.
The other idea I think of when I'm going to have interventions with kids with ADHD is just that I see so many people doing behavioral interventions. And again, I don't use a whole lot of point systems, despite the fact that, there's a mountain of research that they work. We were both trained on a system that is, as close as you can get to perfection as far as point systems go. Yeah. But what will happen is you'll see people put in interventions where they say, okay, once you amass, I think of that episode of The Office where Dwight brings in Shroot Bucks, and it's like, how many Shroot Bucks in order to get an extra 5 minutes of lunch? It's like 10,000 Shroot Bucks. And it's like, okay, well, that would take me, 2 years to earn. Just the basic principle that if you're working on an intervention, a behavioral intervention for a kid with ADHD, and you're talking about something that is beyond what they can perceive realistically, that intervention is going to fail, and it's going to fail miserably.
Yeah. The minute you said that, the thing that occurred to me is so often I see parents come in and well, I told them I'd buy them a PlayStation. What are we on, 5 now?
I think it's actually 6 would be the next one.
Oh, well, I'll buy the PlayStation 5. They got all A's. And in my response is, well, that's like me saying I'll give you $1,000 raise if you have 10 years of perfect attendance at work, because you got to keep in mind that your kid is 13. And so their ideas of time frames are totally different.
Right.
And so keep being sure that the time length of the reward is actually feasible and that they understand it and they can work towards it. And I would say that's probably one of the number one things I see come in. As far like lots of parents have had the idea of trying to reward their kids.
Right.
Yeah, it's not a new idea.
Grounding is a really typical example. You know, people understand, oh, I'm going to take your stuff away and you're grounded for a week and you can't do anything that you want to do. But,
that's a good. Sorry, the fact you brought that up is that it seems like to me the thing I see a lot is the grounding is too long, and the length to get the reward is too long.
And when we say grounding is too long, we mean too long by a large amount.
Yeah.
So, I actually personally want to have a whole episode dedicated to this, like the mental timeline piece. But think about it with a 4-year-old. You don't tell a 4-year-old that you're going to go to Disney World or Nana's house or something today when you're going 2 weeks from now, because a 4-year-old goes, now we're going to Nana's house now, and you're, no, like 2 weeks from now. So now we're going to Nana's house now. And it's like, no, we're not doing that. And we think like if you're going to do an intervention with a 4-year-old, their time frame is about 10 or 20 minutes, maybe. And so if you're going to do something where you want to reward or put in a consequence, you better be operating within that 20-minute time frame that they can actually perceive. So when we say understand, what we mean is if you tell a kid, let's say you tell a 13-year-old kid, you're grounded for a week, their brain hears, you might as well just said you're grounded for forever. Yeah. And then if you get really angry and you're having that typical parent interaction, go, okay, well now you're grounded for 2 weeks. All they heard is you're grounded forever times 2. And that means nothing to them. It just means absolutely nothing.
No, I agree. So I think is keep the reinforcement or the point at which they earn a reward fairly short. If you feel like you're bribing your kids, don't buy them a bunch of things, like have it based on privileges, the things that you're already giving out for free. Just have them do something small and short to get to that.
If you already have a PlayStation 4 in the house, they can still be earning access to the PlayStation 4,
but they earn it nightly. They earn it nightly by doing 20 minutes of homework that night. And I think the things that we recommend are like you brought up earlier is good dieting skills. It's not about like I'm going to do this for a month. No, I'm going to do it for like 20 minutes here. And every day I'm going to try to make good decisions on this. And so, yes, you earn access to privileges nightly. Something short, something maintainable, because we know kids with ADHD, when it comes to working memory, when it comes to ideas of like keeping things in their brain, that they struggle with that. And so working memory is basically our understanding of time. And if that's one of the main struggles is working memory, like telling them that they can have a PlayStation 5 at the end of this semester is just too long.
Yeah, you might as well have said forever away.
So short to like earn it now, earn it for very specific behaviors.
And I always often try to tell people that I'd much rather, if they're earning their privileges, I'd much rather them earn, because that's really going to end up being learning 10 times in a day, than to get grounded once for the entire week, because that's one instance of learning rather than 10 instances of learning. And for a kid with ADHD, I want as many repetitions as I can get in that day. So if it's, you need to earn this, you need to earn that privilege and then this privilege, that's fine by me, especially because I'd rather you do that and have 10 instances of learning than one instance of you're grounded and they learn like, well, crap, don't do that again. And now you've got grounded for a week. You got 30 minutes of learning followed by, 6 days, 23 hours, and 30 minutes of just kind of suffering through the punishment.
Right, and the parents have to suffer through the punishment too. Grounding is way worse on the parents than it is on the kid.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, it is. So I'd rather have a system set up where, we have 3 different things we expect for your kid, and each one of them earns them 20 minutes of electronic time. You get all of them, you get an hour, and if you get all 3 every day, then we can add a bonus on it, something like that. Way better, easier to do than a token system, has way more opportunities for learning. Repetition, go back to the same principle. We've got way more repetitions, we've got way more contrast there. And then I think that, that probably is a general rule of thumb for kids with, I'm about to say kids with ADHD, but now I'm talking about it for kids.
That's all kids. I mean, a lot of these interventions, again, we're not going to go too specific because each family is individual, but most of the things we're talking about apply to just about all kids.
Not everybody. Well, all humans. generally. And so that's what's really...
You've got a timeline, and if I break that timeline, you're going to stop learning. Your brain's going to shut down. And again, I want to do a whole episode on it, so we'll get there at some point. But if we violate that, your brain's going to shut down, and you're not going to get anything from it.
Yeah, right. That timeline, we probably should do, because I start thinking about, like, often I'm working with families, and I can say to the parents, like, a year from now, this time of day, do you know what you're going to be doing? And they usually have a pretty good idea. You ask their kid that, no idea. Nothing.
I get frustrated, maybe not frustrated, but I feel bad if I ask a teenager, like, hey, what are you really wanting? Well, I want to go to college, get a good job, and have a good life. And it's like, well, that's 7 years away, and I don't know anybody operating on a 7-year contingency. What do you want to be today?
Yeah.
Who do you want to be today? That's a much better answer in order to find some sort of motivation and change in behavior. But as far as these interventions go, we probably haven't given enough credit to a researcher named Barkley the entire time. But Barkley is the one that did research. If you want to look it up as a parent, it's called Point of Performance. But basically, it's backed by a lot of behavioral research that if you have a reward or a consequence that is very, very far away from the behavior, it's all for naught. The child's not learning at that point.
Yeah, Russell Barkley was the kind of the person in all this. So
Yeah.
Impulse control, I wanted to talk about a little bit.
So one of the main symptoms of children with ADHD is that they're going to struggle with impulse control. And there's variations of ADHD. We talked about in the diagnostic episode. There can be hyperactive type, there can be inattentive type, but there can be combined. But most of these children are going to struggle with poor impulse control. So this is basically doing things without thinking about it.
I call it ready, fire, aim. Is kind of what they do. They do it, and then they think about whether or not they should have afterwards.
Right. So this could be very different. You could have the same behavior, one being characterized by ADHD, one being characterized by something else. So if you were walking through the lunch line and somebody called you a bad name and you just hauled off and punched them, we'd call that poor impulse control. If somebody called you a bad name and you waited till the end of the day to find them going when they were going to get to the bus and you like jumped them from behind, that's not poor impulse control.
Just smart.
That's
They didn't see it coming.
They didn't see it coming. That's the same behavior, which is physical aggression, but one is characterized by poor impulse control. The other one is very planned out.
Very planned.
So you're going to have to work with kids on impulse control, and this kind of bridges off of the last one, which is the point of performance information is really based off of impulse control, and that impulses are going pretty fast. And if your intervention is not as fast as the kid's impulse, it's probably not meeting whatever they need for a learning experience.
Yeah. So we are working with kids here on having the thought of touching the hot frying pan. We're not working on getting rid of the thought of touching that frying pan. And so the impulse of aggression that they have, we're not working to get rid of the impulse here. We're working on having the impulse and not acting on the impulse. And the intervention should all be designed around that. And so there's nothing wrong with the thought. It was the action on it. And that's really, I think, what it boils. Like, if you've got a kid who has ADHD, just inattentive type, like, probably you may not even find out about it because they don't have the impulse control parts that go along with it. You know, they don't haul off and hit kids. They don't yell out in class, or they don't say the funny thing that they saw in a YouTube video really loud to the teacher. So I think what we would talk about is we're working on having the impulse and then being able to not act on it right away.
Right. Which, again, is going to be a process that takes thousands upon thousands of repetition.
Repetition, yep.
I think when it comes to impulse control, though, one of the things that most of the people in our profession don't talk about, I think a lot of people, if you go see a psychologist, they're going to talk to you about trying to improve impulse control for a kid with ADHD. I think oftentimes you and I are going to also talk about, well, what is the impulse you're having and changing that as well. So the analogy I give to people is, have you ever seen grown men in a fight?
Yeah.
What's it look like?
They flail. Like,
bunch of stupidity, right?
It's
like big haymakers and it's
there's lots of like showmanship of like lots of talk.
Go YouTube any NBA fight, and that's a good example. It's like this moving beehive of a crowd, and like there's a bunch of haymakers that don't connect, and it just looks like stupidity. Right.
Yeah.
But have you ever seen a UFC fight?
Yeah.
Looks pretty cold.
A little different.
Looks pretty controlled. Looks pretty acute, right? And so what I would tell people is most of us all have the same impulse when we get put in a headlock, which is to flail around and try to get out of the headlock. Those guys in the UFC have spent minimum for one individual fight 6 months training themselves of what they want to do when they get put in a headlock, and they change that impulse. What you do in a certain impulsive situation, let's say you're in the therapy room with a family, what you would do instinctively now after having been trained and practiced and doing the job for 10 years is completely different than whatever impulse you would have had when you were a brand new intern, because you have practiced the correct impulse thousands of times. So I always tell people impulse control isn't a problem if the impulse is like impulsively complimenting people.
Right.
If I just tell you, "Hey, you look great today," and you go,
I do look great today.
You didn't really think about that.
Yeah.
I do look great today.
I'm wearing an awesome shirt.
But if that were the impulse, nobody would care. Typically, the impulse is whatever the impulse is a problem. Hitting your brother or hitting a sibling, blurting out in a classroom. But if your intervention for any kid with ADHD is not centered around practicing the correct behavior, then I would say you're not really doing an intervention yet. So if you're doing, most people are familiar with timeouts. You put a kid in a timeout. If you put a kid in a timeout and that's it, that's not a learning experience. The learning experience is put a kid in timeout and then have them do the correct behavior afterwards.
Or put them back in the situation that might trigger the impulse too.
Right.
Yeah, and so I think the way you're describing it, and it hit me as you said this right now, you're talking about developing new habits, and then so my habit of being in a headlock because I have not been trained in jiu-jitsu is much different than somebody else's.
Right.
And so to develop a new habit takes a long time. So for repetition, we probably
repetition.
And so what we're shooting for is developing new habits, and those new habits are developed when the behavior that you're showing works for you in some way. And so you don't think about habit, like the weird habits we have, like cracking our knuckles and biting our fingernails. Those didn't come from nowhere. Those came because they lowered some sort of central nervous system response, and we're not quite as nervous when we bite our fingernails. Like they came because they got us something. And so we're shooting for, and we're developing an intervention for somebody with ADHD, or it is to set it up so that showing a new habit that we find to be more socially acceptable is going to get you something.
Right.
And we want it to get to a point that when you're tired and you're hungry and you've just got home from school and you were stressed, you make the right habit. You go in and brush your teeth. Or something, whatever that weird habit is. Like I was thinking about my mom always said when we were growing up that even though she had worked on us so much with brushing her teeth, I'd fall asleep in the car on the way home and I'd walk in in a sleepwalk and brush my teeth right away. And it's she developed a really good habit, made it happen.
I guess I just think, let's say a pretty typical experience for a family would be you got two siblings, they argue, one punches the other one, and then you get grounded. You're grounded for 2 days, don't get any electronics. That's kind of the end of it. I would say it would be so much better if whatever you did for an intervention, at the end of that, walk the kid through it rather than, you did that and so now you're punished. It should be, okay, here's the punishment. Okay, you're done with the punishment. Now let's practice that again. Your brother's going to tell you that, something awful, and you have to not punch them, and you have to say, I don't like this, I'm going to go tell mom, or whatever the intervention would be. But whatever the desirable behavior is, they ought to practice that desirable behavior.
Yeah, have a fire drill. Yeah. Go back and do it again. And let's do it in non-emotional state, because the only way to learn something is a non-emotional state. And then maybe when you're in that emotional state, you'll go back to the thing you tried 100 times. Yeah, I agree with that totally.
We're really big, though. I don't think it's necessarily cultural. I just think it's from top down, parents to kids. We're really big on telling kids what not to do. We're very rarely telling them what to do.
Yeah. I was
don't blurt out instead of, here's how you raise
here's how you do this. Yeah. Yeah. I thought you were about to say something else. I think we're also really, no, I agree with that. I think we're really big on what do we do during the middle of the emergency? And we're not very big on how do I prevent the emergency?
Right.
What do I do to be sure that doesn't happen in the future? And other than the fire drills analogy, I said schools all over the world are practicing fire drills, and because they've understood that we don't learn what to do during a fire. We learn what to do during the drill. And then we're hoping that it's a habit, so that way when the fire comes, that's what we do. And families that I work with never have drills. They just have fires. And then they come to a psychologist to figure out what to do during the fire.
I actually feel like I do that a lot with my kids with anxiety that I work with, that they'll say some sort of fire drill scenario to me, and I just play it out with them. Okay, let's walk through this fire drill. What if somebody breaks into my home? Okay, what if somebody breaks into your home? What are you going to do?
Play into that.
Yeah, let's actually come up with a plan here, because very rarely, most people would say, a kid says, well, what happens if somebody breaks into our home? And what does every adult say?
They're not going to break into
No one's going to break into your home, and it's like, well, okay, let's actually do, what happens if a fire happens? Well, let's do a fire drill. Okay, what happens if there's a fire?
Let's do it, yeah.
Okay.
He's removing the chunking.
Yeah, so another like basic behavioral intervention that we would tell everybody if you're working with a kid with ADHD that you ought to be familiar with is a process called chunking. Chunking is the idea of breaking things into pieces that are digestible for the person. So if you're working with a kid with ADHD and you tell them a big job that's really difficult for them to wrap their head around, that you should break that job into pieces. The basic idea would be, don't tell a kid to go clean the room. Tell them to go pick up all the clothes. Now throw away all the trash. Now get the bed made. And eventually you'll have a clean room, but they need that in digestible pieces.
Right. Because at the heart of the disorder itself is executive function, which is planning, and they don't see clean my room as like this list of tasks I have to do. They don't even see tasks sometimes. So it just breaking it down for them, making it more manageable, shaping it up, having each one of those steps followed by some sort of positive reinforcement, which doesn't have to be like video game time. It can just be your attention, your praise, which is very meaningful to them, especially the younger they are.
Yeah.
If they're older, then freedom is much more meaningful. But just breaking it down, they struggle with that.
I think it goes back into some of the timeline stuff that if you got a kid thinking, I mean, let's say you got a kid whose room is a disaster and you say, go clean your room. And they think, well, that's going to take me 3 hours. But if I go in and say, okay, just pick up all the clothes.
Yep.
Okay, there's 15 minutes. Okay, now pick up all the trash. Okay, there's 15 minutes. Okay, now make the bed. Okay, there's 15 minutes. That is much more digestible. That actually works out. There's research that actually says, and I think we as adults, again, that we talked about in one of the other episodes, that a kid can see a box and play with a box, and we see the box and we're like, oh, it's just a box, idiot, move along. But there's actually research that if you take, let's say you've got a homework sheet and it's got 10 problems on it, and you introduce to the kid, okay, here's 2 problems, just do these 2. And then you move the paper down and you go, okay, here's the next 2 problems, do those 2. Then you move the paper down. Here's the next 2 problems, do those. Eventually you're going to end up with 10 problems that are completely completed and the homework is done. But it's so much easier for their brain to digest 2 problems at a time. They think it's like running a marathon 1 mile at a time. If you just think you got to run all the miles all at once, it doesn't work out that way.
Right. And I think we have been fairly critical of psychology as a field for just making things up. But there are things psychologists have found, and response effort is the thing we found. And so response effort is this idea that we look at a task and we decide how much effort it's going to take, and that's how we gauge whether or not we're going to do it.
Right.
And there's lots of good research on this. There's some research. I don't know. Did you ever see the research where they move the ashtrays?
Yeah.
Yes. So there's some research where they move ashtrays in front of buildings and they move them further and further away from the door. And the further they get away from the door, you can count the number of cigarette butts out. And like the more and more they move it away from the door, the more and more cigarette butts you see.
The more inconvenient it is to go find the ashtray, the less people are going to use it.
And so this is one of those things where psychologists did a study and then they were like, oh, this is interesting. The harder we make this, the more cigarette butts are out there. Let's call that response effort. It wasn't like, let's think of response effort and then let's find a way to measure it, which is the way a lot of psychology is done. And so what you're talking about is an idea of response effort. If we make the effort not seem so hard, you're going to get them to try it. If you get them to try it, then you can reinforce it. If you get them to reinforce it, it can start to become a part of their personality. And then we go back to habit development that we started off earlier. And so it also a little bit of self-efficacy too. If you believe you're going to be successful, you're way more likely to try.
Yeah.
And so I think that let's take advantage of that. Response effort's one of those things psychologists actually found, and it is a thing. Let's use it.
I think a real common intervention I see is, again, I don't mean to bag on the schools, but a real common intervention I see is, oh, well, everybody else got 10 questions for homework. This kid's just going to do 4. And just completely hacking off 6 questions because, well, this kid's got an IEP, so I'm not going to give them all the homework. And that's the opposite of the intervention we're talking about right now, which is they can do the same amount of homework. Just give it to them in digestible pieces. Give them 2, 3, questions at a time rather than all 15 all at once. And you're going to get the same work and the same effort out of these kids.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think also people underestimate how big that working memory piece is, even for good things. So, Toys R Us doesn't really exist anymore, but let's say you took a kid into Toys R Us and you just said, hey, you can pick anything in here that you like. That would be completely overwhelming
totally
with ADHD.
It's like me going to the Cheesecake Factory. It's just too much on the menu. I don't know what to do. It's so good.
This menu's 14 pages long. But, you take a kid into Toys R Us and you go, hey, pick anything you want.
Yeah.
And you see them crumble because they don't have that executive functioning skills to go, okay, I can skip aisles 2 and 3. Those aren't toys I like. I'll go down to aisle 1, see if there's anything I like. I'll go down to aisle 4. So, I mean, you have to break it into, okay, we're going to break this into 3 steps. We're going to check aisle 1, see if you like anything. Go to aisle 2, see if you like anything. Go to aisle 3, see if you like anything. And the idea that we would break that down, even in good stuff, like, hey, you can pick anything that you'd like to do. And all of a sudden you gave them a big task that's just undigestible.
Mm-hmm. Have we covered chunking there?
I think so. I guess I would
send
just
a question in if you didn't get chunking.
I think the big part about chunking is just to keep in mind that if you're ever looking at somebody and they're struggling with problem solving for something, just break it down into steps of 3.
Yeah.
Like break it down into 3 pieces. Whatever you're working on, break it down into 3 pieces. If that doesn't work, break that down into 3 pieces.
Like the piece of feedback I often give parents is like, if you were having this thought of like, my kid should be able to do this thing, they should be able to clean the room. They should be able to get through their morning routine. What I found is they have not broken down the task enough to where they've actually learned each individual step.
Yeah. If you're making an intervention for a child with ADHD or for an individual with ADHD, just keep in mind that their learning experiences are very applied and very physical. Yeah. That having a kid with ADHD do algebra with like physical moving pieces that they can actually manipulate would probably be better than just scribing out some sort of worksheet that they're given. Mm-hmm. And we don't do that a whole lot anymore. One of my big complaints all the time is, the show Magic School Bus. Remember that old cartoon?
Yeah. I remember it. Yeah.
The basic premise is that the kids have a magic school bus, and when the teacher brings up a lesson, they go actually do the lesson. Yeah. And I think that's such a far-fetched idea that it's a cartoon. If we're going to learn about volcanoes, you should go to volcanoes. If we learn about a farm, you go to a farm. That is so far-fetched that it's a cartoon. And for kids with ADHD, I'd say all kids, but it should be, they would learn so much better about farms if you would go to a stinking farm and have an applied experience of what it is.
Right. If I had 10 kids who read books about how to climb trees and I had 10 kids who've just been climbing trees for the past year, which ones do I think is going to do better?
Right.
It's like, I actually think that one of the Harry Potter movies made fun of this really bad.
I know one of them started getting into like all the like statewide or nationwide testing.
They brought a professor in who just would allow them. They wouldn't actually be able to do magic. They just were They just could only read the books about it. And I thought that they were kind of making fun of that whole idea.
I think that's a great example though, because Hogwarts is like when you go do potions, you learn to do potions. When you get your wand, you learn to use your wand. I'm not a big Harry Potter person, but I know that it's all pretty applied experiences, and everybody watches those movies like, man, it would be really great to go to Hogwarts. You want to know why? Because they're actually doing the freaking thing they're talking about.
And so kids learn like, so I always kind of talk with some of my clients about like, we have a what was the Louise Hayes model, the DNA, like we have a discoverer, we have a noticer and we have an advisor. And so like noticer is that part of our brain that thinks, advisor is part of our brain that thinks, and noticer is like our senses, we see, taste, touch, smell, feel, but then we have this discoverer, and the discoverer is the thing that tries things. And in kids, that is the strongest thing. Mm-hmm. They discover, and that's how they figure out what works. They don't advise near as much as adults do. An adult can look at a situation and go, oh, if I do that, that could hurt. If I do that, this person might be mad at me, because they have that like thing in their brain that's going around in the background, kind of like figuring out, like almost like a GPS of like, all right, well, if I do this, then I'll go that way. If I do that, but like kids touch that frying pan. Kids have to climb the tree to figure out how to do it, and it's not until later in life that we develop that strong advisor, and they have to discover. That's where they figure out what works.
Which, helicopter parenting is the exact opposite.
Exact opposite. Yeah. It's like you're just, and there is some research on that. Like the more that you step in and do that thing for kids, they try less. So we want to get them discovering.
Mm-hmm. Which means a lot of mistakes, which means difficulty for parents.
Yeah, they hate it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's scary.
Yeah. But the other part of that would just be a pretty common intervention you're going to find in the schools, where there's not a whole lot of applied learning, though, is you can set up pretty simple communication to try and make some of that applied learning at home.
Right. Yeah. I would say that's the most common intervention I do with kids with ADHD is some sort of daily behavior report card.
Like a homeschool note.
A homeschool note. We maybe put a link to Jim Wright's interventioncentral.org on this. He can help you set up a daily behavior report card where, kid gets a report that comes home every day about their behavior, and then you can reward that at home. And so that's at least daily learning. We prefer, I think, even more than daily, but that's something. And it just improves communication from school to parents.
The only issue I have with those most of the time is I see people monitoring behaviors that are way too nebulous to describe. It's like, he was respectful. What the heck does that mean?
Yeah.
Does the kid even understand what it means? If you give them feedback, hey, you were pretty respectful. Do they go, okay, good deal?
All three adults in the room at that time would have disagreed on what that means.
Right.
So those goals should be very clear, like kept their hands to themselves.
If you're working on impulse control, that should be the behavior that the homeschool note is monitoring. If you're working on compliance, that should be what the homeschool note is regarding. That's what should be monitored.
And like what you brought up earlier is right on there the goal that you want to see, not the goal you don't want to see.
Right.
So don't hit. That would be, let's not write that on there, because last thing they hear is hit. Mm-hmm. Keep your hands to yourself. Don't cuss. Don't put that on there. Mm-hmm. Use appropriate language or use nice words for younger kids.
I see all the time. I mean, one, if you're again going back to the chunking, if you've got ideas and lists or behaviors that you're monitoring for kids, and you're past 5 or 6 behaviors, they're no longer paying attention to that. I mean, it should be succinct, but then I also will, on the other side of that, I'll see kindergarten classrooms all the time where like there's 3 rules, but one of the rules is be kind. And it's like, well, that's true, but it's just so stinking nebulous that like the kids may not even understand what you're talking about.
It's a wasted rule. Yeah. I mean, yes, I'm not going to, it probably makes it sound terrible. Like, I don't want kids to be kind to each other. So
no, we do. It's just,
of course.
Okay. What would a kindergartner's version of be kind be?
Yeah.
Okay. Make that the rule.
Yeah. Right. Write it out in a way that you can actually describe the behavior. So I guess the research on that is pretty good. Homeschool notes, just improve communication between the homeschool, improve behavior at school that can be reinforced at home. I'm a huge fan of those.
I would say depending on the behavioral intervention you're doing, it's almost pivotal. If you're doing something like a point system, I don't know how you're really even being successful if you're not doing a homeschool note where you can't collaborate between those two settings.
Yep. I think that probably covers us, doesn't it?
Yeah. I guess what's our take home for families? We always kind of end on a.
It seems like the thing that we've been talking about is just lots of repetition.
Yeah.
Building good habits, being sure that you're breaking down the task.
I think if you go see someone that does what we do, you're hopefully going to have an experience where you and your family get an intervention very much tailored to you. Mm-hmm. I think we tried to avoid any type of specifically named intervention of any kind, but the idea would be if you're going to sign up for a behavioral intervention, that the key is repetition, and then a little more repetition, and then some more repetition.
Yeah, and even after you think you got it, keep going.
Yeah. So hopefully if you have someone in your area that you can seek out, you can get a behavioral intervention that might be tailored to your child or to your family. But keep in mind that, like, again, I kind of think it's very similar to when we talked about the physical activity piece, that we're really not talking about a behavioral intervention. We're kind of talking about a family culture change. We're talking about you're going to be operating differently in the home at this point.
Mm-hmm. Daily training, yeah. Changing some daily habits.
Okay. Good to go?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that wraps up at least what we had planned for the series on ADHD. We would still love questions, and there's more to be talked about when it comes to ADHD, so send us your questions. Mm-hmm. But if not...
subscribe, share, tell your friends, dozens of followers.
And we'll see you guys next episode. Thanks. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. You can follow us on our Instagram at DMB Psychology for updates and to submit any comments or questions. You can also find us on our website, domorebetter.buzzsprout.com, where we have info on all episodes as well as our donations and merchandise links if you'd like to support the podcast. You can search for us on YouTube and all major podcast platforms under Do More Better.